Ethan leaned back in his chair, the faint creak of the wood breaking the evening's quiet. The small, warm kitchen smelled of Zera's favorite lavender tea, the mug cooling between her hands as she sat across from him, her gaze distant. Rex, their German shepherd, lay at her feet, his eyes half closed but alert, his ears twitching occasionally as though tuned to a frequency beyond Ethan's perception. It had started subtly, the peculiar bond between Zera and Rex. Ethan had always known she loved the dog fiercely. It was one of the things he adored about her. She had rescued Rex from a shelter 2 years ago, insisting from the moment they locked eyes that he was special. And he was. The dog's intelligence, loyalty, and almost preternatural ability to sense danger had made him an inseparable part of their lives. But lately, things felt off. Ethan watched as Zera absently stroked Rex's fur, her fingers moving with a rhythmic precision that seemed more purposeful than casual affection. Rex, for his part, seemed entirely absorbed in her touch, his head tilted slightly as though he were listening to something only he could hear. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't even sure what he wanted to ask. "Long day?" Zera asked suddenly, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. She looked at him now, her dark eyes soft but tired. "Yeah," Ethan said after a pause. "Work was. The usual." She nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips, but her attention drifted back to Rex almost immediately. It wasn't just tonight, he realized. She had been distant for weeks now, retreating into some quiet space that he couldn't follow. And Rex was always there with her, as though he were the gatekeeper to something Ethan wasn't allowed to see. The first unsettling moment had come a few days ago. Ethan had been working in the yard, hammering at a loose fence post when he glanced toward the house. Through the window, he saw Zera sitting on the couch, Rex beside her. She was speaking, her lips moving quickly, her expression animated in a way he hadn't seen in months. At first, he thought she was on a video call, but the angle of her gaze told a different story. She was talking to Rex. Ethan shook his head, chuckling to himself. People talked to their pets all the time, it wasn't unusual. But as he continued to watch, the scene took on an eerie quality. Zera wasn't just talking, she was conversing. She paused as though waiting for a reply, her hand resting lightly on Rex's head. And then the dog shifted, tilting his head and letting out a low, soft rumble that sounded almost deliberate. Ethan set down his hammer, suddenly uneasy. He moved toward the house, stepping inside just as Zera stopped speaking. She turned to look at him, her expression calm. But there was something behind her eyes, something guarded. "What were you doing?" he asked casually, trying to keep his tone light. Zera shrugged, running her fingers through Rex's fur. "Just talking to Rex. You know how he always seems to understand." Ethan nodded, though the explanation didn't sit right with him. He glanced at Rex, who was watching him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. The dog's amber eyes seemed too knowing, as though he were sizing Ethan up, deciding whether to trust him. Ethan shook off the thought, chalking it up to his imagination. Over the next few days, the strange moments piled up. Rex would intercept Ethan before he could enter a room where Zera was alone, standing in the doorway as if to block his path. Zera began spending more time in the backyard, sitting cross-legged on the grass with Rex beside her, her gaze lost in the horizon. Ethan once caught her whispering into Rex's ear, her voice too low for him to make out the words. When he asked her about it, she laughed it off, saying it was just nonsense dog-mom talk. But the incident that truly shook him came one night during an argument. It had been a small thing, a stupid misunderstanding about dinner plans, but the tension between them had been simmering for weeks. Ethan's voice rose despite himself, frustration bubbling over as Zera stood her ground, her expression unflinching. And then Rex moved. The dog, who had been lying quietly by the couch, stood and positioned himself between them. His hackles didn't rise and he didn't growl, but the weight of his presence was undeniable. He looked at Ethan, his gaze steady and unyielding, as though warning him to tread carefully. "Rex, get out of the way," Ethan said, his voice faltering. But Rex didn't move. Instead, he turned his head slightly toward Zera, who placed a hand on his back. The gesture was small, but it felt deliberate, intimate. As though they were communicating in a language Ethan couldn't understand. "That's enough," Zera said softly, her tone carrying an edge that silenced Ethan immediately. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. This isn't about Rex. But it felt like it was. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the events of the day replaying in his mind. Zera slept beside him, her breathing soft and even, but the distance between them felt vast. He glanced toward the foot of the bed, where Rex lay curled in his usual spot. The dog's eyes were closed, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Rex was awake, silently observing. Finally, he slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Zera. He made his way to the living room and sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. He felt ridiculous, paranoid, but he couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something was deeply, inexplicably wrong. As he sat there, the sound of soft footsteps reached his ears. He looked up to see Zera standing in the doorway, her figure illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights outside. "Ethan," she said quietly, her voice heavy with something he couldn't name. "Why are you out here?" He hesitated, then gestured toward the couch. "I couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind." She walked over and sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said, "I know you've noticed." "About Rex." Ethan's breath caught. He turned to her, his chest tightening. "Zera, what's going on? I need to know." She looked at him, her dark eyes shimmering with an emotion he couldn't place. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you," she said softly. "But it's not something you'll understand easily." "Try me," he said, his voice trembling. Zera exhaled, her gaze drifting toward the hallway where Rex slept. "Rex isn't just a dog, Ethan. He's more. He always has been." Her words sent a shiver down his spine, and as she began to speak, the unease that had been haunting him deepened into something far more profound. The days after Zera's cryptic admission felt like walking a tightrope in a dark room. Ethan couldn't shake the chill her words had left in him. Rex isn't just a dog, he's more. The statement echoed in his mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. He had pushed for more answers that night, but Zera had deflected, claiming it wasn't the right time. Now, the mystery of her connection with Rex consumed his thoughts. The first crack in the fragile facade of normalcy came on an otherwise unremarkable morning. Ethan had been making coffee, the sound of the grinder filling the quiet kitchen. Zera was outside with Rex, their figures barely visible through the sliding glass door. She knelt on the grass, her hands on either side of Rex's face, her forehead pressed to his. Ethan paused mid-motion, his hand hovering over the coffee maker. The scene was intimate, but not in the way he might expect between a person and their pet. There was something deeper, something sacred, about the way Zera held herself. Her lips moved, forming words Ethan couldn't hear. Rex sat perfectly still, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. Unable to contain his curiosity, Ethan stepped outside. Zera didn't look up as he approached, her focus entirely on Rex. The dog's ears twitched, but he remained still, his gaze unwavering. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. Zera jerked her head up, startled, and Rex rose immediately, placing himself between them as if to shield her. Zera's expression hardened, and for a moment Ethan thought she might snap at him. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Ethan," she said softly, standing. "You shouldn't sneak up on us." "You didn't hear me come out," he replied, his tone sharper than he intended. "Because you were." "What? Meditating with Rex? Talking to him like he's a person?" Zera's jaw tightened. "I told you. There's more to this than you realize. And I want to understand," Ethan said, frustration bleeding into his voice. "But you won't let me in, Zera. It's like you're keeping me out of something important. Something strange." Her gaze flickered to Rex, who sat beside her like a sentinel, his amber eyes fixed on Ethan. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you everything." "Try me," Ethan said, his voice low. "Because right now I don't know what to believe anymore." Zera hesitated, her fingers brushing absently against Rex's fur. "I'll explain," she said finally. "But not here. Not now." Before Ethan could protest, she turned and walked inside, Rex following at her heels. The tension between them deepened over the next few days. Ethan found himself watching Zera and Rex more closely, unable to shake the feeling that he was missing something critical. Every interaction between them seemed to carry an unspoken weight, an invisible thread, connecting them in ways Ethan couldn't understand. It wasn't just the way Zera spoke to Rex as though he could answer, or the way Rex seemed to anticipate her every move. It was the uncanny way they moved as one, as if tied together by some unseen force. When Zera was upset, Rex would appear at her side before Ethan even noticed her mood shift. When she laughed, Rex's ears would perk up, his tail wagging as though he shared in her joy. One evening, as Ethan watched them from the couch, he couldn't hold back his frustration any longer. "Zera," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the television. "What's really going on with you and Rex?" Zera looked up from where she was sitting on the floor, Rex's head resting on her lap. She didn't answer immediately, her fingers trailing through the dog's fur in slow, deliberate strokes. "Ethan," she began, her tone cautious. "You already know part of it. I've told you he's more than just a dog." Yeah, you've told me, Ethan said, his voice edged with irritation. But you haven't explained what that actually means. Zera hesitated, her gaze dropping to Rex. The dog looked up at her, his amber eyes filled with something Ethan couldn't name. It was almost human. Zera took a deep breath, then met Ethan's gaze. Rex isn't just a dog because his soul isn't bound to this form, she said softly. He's someone I've known before, in another life. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, heavy and charged. Ethan stared at her, his mind racing. He wanted to dismiss her claim, to laugh it off as some strange joke, but the sincerity in her voice rooted him to the spot. Another life, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Zera, what are you talking about? Zera reached for Rex, her hand resting on his head. I know how it sounds, she said, but I've felt it since the moment I saw him. He's not just a dog, Ethan. He's someone I've been connected to across lifetimes. Ethan shook his head, his chest tightening. This doesn't make any sense. You're telling me. What? That Rex is reincarnated? Yes, she said simply. And in every life he's found his way back to me. The room felt too small, the air too thin. Ethan stood, pacing to the window as he tried to process her words. Zera, this is. I don't know what this is. It's insane. It's the truth, she said quietly. I've seen it in my dreams. Flashes of memories that aren't from this life. In one, he was a knight who protected me in a war-torn village. In another, he was a scientist who worked alongside me in a future we didn't survive. And now, he's here. Ethan turned to face her, his chest heaving. You're asking me to believe that this dog is some kind of eternal soulmate. I'm not asking you to believe anything, Zera said, her voice steady. I'm just telling you what I know. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his mind a whirl of disbelief and jealousy. He didn't want to believe her, but the conviction in her voice shook him. And then there was Rex sitting at her side, his eyes fixed on Ethan with a calm intensity that made his skin prickle. I need air, Ethan said abruptly, grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. Outside, the night was cool and quiet. The stars scattered across the sky like shattered glass. Ethan leaned against the porch railing, his thoughts spinning. He wanted to dismiss everything Zera had said as nonsense, but deep down he couldn't ignore the pieces that didn't add up. The way Rex seemed to understand Zera's emotions better than he ever could, the way they moved together like two halves of the same whole. He stayed outside for a long time, staring at the stars, until the sound of the door opening behind him drew his attention. Zera stepped onto the porch, her arms crossed against the chill. Rex followed, sitting at her feet like a silent guardian. I know this is hard for you, Zera said softly, but I need you to trust me. Ethan looked at her, his chest tightening. I don't know if I can, Zera. This changes everything. It doesn't have to, she said, stepping closer. You don't have to understand it all right now, just don't walk away from us. Her words hung in the air, and Ethan felt the weight of her plea settle over him. He glanced at Rex, who met his gaze with an almost human expression of patience and understanding. For the first time, Ethan wondered if there might be more to the dog's eyes than he had ever allowed himself to see. The wind outside howled against the windows, the sound of mournful wail that matched the tension in the room. Ethan sat across from Zera at the kitchen table, his hands clenched into fists on the smooth surface. Rex lay beside her chair, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes were open, watching Ethan with a gaze that felt almost too perceptive. All right, Ethan said, breaking the silence. His voice was taut, like a rope stretched too tight. You said you'd explain. No more half-truths, no more cryptic comments. Just tell me what's going on. Zera exhaled slowly, her fingers curling around the edge of the table. You're not going to like it. Try me, he said, though the knot in his stomach told him he might regret those words. For a moment, she didn't speak. She looked at Rex, her dark eyes softening as if seeking strength from the dog. Rex shifted slightly, his tail thumping once against the floor, a silent signal that Ethan didn't understand. When I met Rex, Zera began, her voice low, I knew there was something different about him. It wasn't just his intelligence or how quickly he bonded with me. It was a feeling, like I'd known him before. Ethan raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. Zera's gaze flicked to him, her expression pained. It didn't make sense at first, she continued. But then I started having dreams. Vivid dreams, more like memories than anything else. In them, I saw myself in different lives, different times and places. And Rex, he was always there. Always there, Ethan repeated, his skepticism sharp. What does that even mean? Zera hesitated, her fingers brushing against Rex's fur. In some lives, he wasn't a dog, he was a person. A knight who swore to protect me during a medieval siege. A scientist who stood beside me in a dying world. A friend, a lover, a guardian. Always the same soul, no matter the form. Ethan blinked, his throat dry. You're saying Rex has been reincarnated? Across lifetimes? And you've been. What, soulmates? Yes, Zera said simply. It's the only explanation that makes sense. Every time I lose him, he finds me again. This time he came back as a dog. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. He wanted to laugh, to call the idea absurd, but the sincerity in Zera's voice stopped him cold. Do you hear yourself, he asked, his tone harsher than he intended. You're saying the dog lying under your chair is the reincarnation of some long-lost lover. I'm saying he's more than just a dog, Zera replied, her voice steady. You've seen it, Ethan. The way he knows what I'm feeling before I even say anything. The way he reacts to things he shouldn't understand. Have you never wondered why? Ethan opened his mouth to argue but stopped short. He had wondered. He'd seen the way Rex seemed to move in perfect sync with Zera, anticipating her moods, her needs. He'd dismissed it as a coincidence, a bond between a woman and her dog. But now, with Zera's words hanging in the air, those moments felt far less explainable. You're asking me to believe something impossible, he said finally. No, Zera said. I'm asking you to believe in something bigger than yourself. Bigger than what you think you know. The air in the room grew heavier, the silence between them crackling with unspoken tension. Rex rose from his spot on the floor and moved to Zera's side, sitting tall and steady like a sentinel. His amber eyes locked onto Ethan's, and for a moment, Ethan felt an uncanny sense of awareness in the dog's gaze. It wasn't just intelligence, it was something deeper, something that sent a chill down his spine. Zera reached out, placing a hand on Rex's head. In every life, he's been my protector. Sometimes he saves me, sometimes I save him, but we always find each other. Ethan's chest tightened. And what about me, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Where do I fit into all of this? Zera's expression softened, and for the first time that night she reached across the table, her hand brushing against his. You're here now, she said. You're part of this life, this story. I love you, Ethan. That hasn't changed. But it's not the same, he said, pulling his hand away. How am I supposed to compete with a connection that spans lifetimes? With a bond like that? You don't have to compete, Zera said, her voice breaking slightly. This isn't about competition. It's about acceptance. I didn't choose this connection, Ethan, it just is. But that doesn't mean I love you any less. Ethan stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The wind had picked up, rattling the panes as if echoing the storm inside him. He turned back to Zera, his emotions a tangled mess of jealousy, disbelief, and something deeper, something he didn't want to name. And Rex, he said, gesturing to the dog. What happens now? Am I supposed to just coexist with him? Pretend this is normal? Nothing about this is normal, Zera admitted. But it's real. And I need you to trust me, Ethan. Please. Ethan stared at her, his mind racing. He wanted to walk away, to leave the house and the impossible truth she had laid before him. But as his gaze shifted to Rex, something stopped him. The dog was watching him intently, his amber eyes filled with a quiet patience that was almost unbearable. It was as if Rex was waiting for Ethan to see what Zera saw, to accept what couldn't be explained. I don't know if I can do this, Ethan said finally, his voice cracking. You can, Zera said, standing and moving to his side. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm and grounding. Because I can't do this without you. Her words hit him harder than he expected. And for a moment, the walls he had built around his heart began to crumble. He looked at her, at the raw vulnerability in her eyes, and then at Rex, who sat silently, his presence steady and unwavering. Okay, Ethan said, the word heavy with reluctance. Okay, but I need time, Zera, to figure out how to deal with all of this. Zera nodded, her lips trembling with relief. Take all the time you need. Just don't shut me out. Ethan glanced at Rex one last time, the dog's gaze meeting his with an intensity that made him shiver. I won't, he said, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. As Zera pulled him into a hug, Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of the truth settling over him like a storm cloud. He didn't understand it, didn't know if he ever would, but for now he chose to stay. And in that moment, it was enough. The days after Zera's revelation were a minefield, every interaction between her and Ethan charged with unspoken tension. The house, once filled with laughter and shared routines, felt like a hollow shell. The quiet moments they used to cherish now bristled with unease, a sense of something broken hanging heavily in the air. And always there was Rex, his steady, watchful presence, both a comfort to Zera and a point of contention for Ethan. Ethan avoided Zera as much as he could. He buried himself in work, taking extra hours at the office and spending late nights in the garage, tinkering with old tools that didn't need fixing. But no matter how far he distanced himself, the questions lingered, gnawing at him like a relentless ache. How could she love me and still feel so deeply connected to him? What does that make me in this equation a placeholder? An outsider? One evening, as Ethan sat in the garage nursing a beer, the door creaked open. Zera stood there, silhouetted against the light spilling from the kitchen. Her expression was hesitant, her eyes searching his for some flicker of warmth that wasn't there. "Ethan," she said softly, stepping inside. "We need to talk." He didn't look up. "What's there to talk about? You already said your piece." "I told you the truth," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But you've barely looked at me since. You've barely been here." He set the beer down with a sharp clink. "What do you want me to do, Zera? Pretend everything's fine? That I'm okay sharing you with?" He gestured toward the house, his voice breaking. "A dog." Her face fell, and for a moment she looked as though he'd struck her. "It's not about sharing," she said quietly. "You're twisting this into something it's not." "What am I supposed to think?" he shot back, his frustration spilling over. "You told me Rex is some eternal soulmate, Zera. That every life you've lived, he's been there. How am I supposed to compete with that?" "You don't have to compete," she said, stepping closer. "This isn't a competition, Ethan. It's a connection. One that doesn't take away from what I feel for you." He laughed bitterly, running a hand through his hair. "Do you even hear yourself? You're asking me to be okay with something that goes against everything I know? Everything I believe?" Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment she didn't speak. When she finally did, her voice was soft, almost pleading. "I never asked you to believe. I just wanted you to trust me. That's hard to do when you've been hiding this from me for months," he snapped. Zera's gaze hardened, the vulnerability in her eyes replaced with something sharper. "Do you think I wanted this?" she said, her voice rising. "Do you think I wanted to feel torn between you and something I don't fully understand myself? I told you the truth because I love you, Ethan. Because I didn't want to lose you." "Well, congratulations," he said coldly, standing and moving toward the door. "You've made it impossible for me to stay." The words left his mouth before he could stop them, and as soon as they hung in the air, he regretted them. Zera flinched as if struck, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, without another word, Ethan brushed past her and walked into the night. The distance between them grew in the days that followed. Zera retreated into herself, spending most of her time with Rex in the backyard or on long walks that Ethan no longer joined. Ethan stayed out late, returning home long after Zera had gone to bed, the silence of their once shared life now unbearable. But no matter how much he tried to bury his feelings, Rex's presence loomed like a shadow. The dog seemed to sense the tension, watching Ethan with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Every glance from those amber eyes felt like an accusation, a silent reminder of the truth Ethan refused to face. One night, as Ethan sat alone in the living room, the sound of soft footsteps drew his attention. He turned to see Rex standing in the doorway, his gaze locked onto Ethan's. There was something unnerving about the way the dog looked at him, calm, patient, as though waiting for Ethan to break the silence. "What do you want?" Ethan muttered, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "You here to tell me she's right?" Rex didn't move, didn't bark or growl. He simply stood there, his tail swishing slowly against the floor. For a brief, disorienting moment, Ethan felt as though the dog understood him, as though he were listening in a way no human ever had. It sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "I don't know how to do this," Ethan said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. "I don't know how to be enough when you've already been everything to her." Rex tilted his head slightly, a gesture so familiar it made Ethan's chest ache. He thought of all the times he'd seen Zera speaking to Rex, the way she would lean close and whisper secrets Ethan had never been privy to. The jealousy flared again, sharp and bitter, but this time it was joined by something else, a flicker of guilt. Was he really losing Zera to Rex, or was he pushing her away out of fear? The turning point came the following week. Ethan had been avoiding another confrontation with Zera, but when he came home late one night, he found her sitting on the couch, waiting for him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet determination in her eyes that sent a pang of unease through him. "We can't keep doing this," she said as he set his keys down. "Avoiding each other. Pretending like this will go away if we just stop talking about it." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "What do you want me to say, Zera? That I'm fine with this? That I'm okay with whatever this is between you and Rex?" No, she said firmly. I want you to tell me how you feel. Really feel. No more deflecting, no more sarcasm. Just tell me the truth. He hesitated, his chest tightening. I feel like I'm losing you, he admitted finally, his voice cracking. Like I'll never be enough because there's a part of you that already belongs to him. Zera's expression softened, and she stood, crossing the room to stand in front of him. You're not losing me, she said quietly. But if you keep shutting me out, if you keep treating this like it's some kind of betrayal, you might. Her words hit him like a blow, and he looked away, his throat tightening. I don't know how to trust this, Zera. I don't know how to trust you. She reached for his hand, her touch warm and grounding. Then start small, she said softly. Trust that I love you. Trust that I chose you for this life. Ethan looked at her, his heart aching. He wanted to believe her, to let go of the fear and the jealousy that had consumed him. But the fractures in their trust ran deep, and the road to mending them felt impossibly long. Still, for the first time in weeks, he nodded. I'll try. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And as Zera squeezed his hand, a flicker of hope sparked in the quiet space between them. The storm arrived suddenly, rolling over the quiet suburb with a ferocity that seemed almost unnatural. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the landscape in stark, jagged bursts, while thunder rattled the windows of the house. Inside, Ethan paced the living room, his movements restless as the storm mirrored the turmoil in his mind. Zera had gone to bed hours ago, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Rex lay on the rug, his head resting on his paws, his amber eyes tracking Ethan's every move. The dog's calm presence should have been soothing, but tonight it felt suffocating, like an unspoken challenge Ethan couldn't escape. You don't make this easy, you know, Ethan muttered, pausing to glare at Rex. Sitting there like you've got it all figured out. Rex didn't move, didn't even blink. The quiet understanding in his gaze only deepened Ethan's frustration. He turned away, his fists clenching at his sides as the storm raged outside. The accident happened just after midnight. Ethan had finally decided to clear his head, grabbing his coat and stepping out into the storm, despite the howling wind and driving rain. He barely made it to the end of the driveway before the slippery pavement betrayed him. His foot slipped on the wet concrete, and he went down hard, his head striking the edge of the curb with a sickening thud. For a moment, there was only blackness. Then, the visions began. Ethan found himself standing in a field bathed in golden light. The air was warm, carrying the scent of wildflowers and something ancient, almost sacred. He looked down at his hands, surprised to find them steady despite the strange, dreamlike quality of the scene. Ahead of him, two figures stood in the field. One was Zera, her dark hair shining in the sunlight, her expression serene. The other was a man Ethan didn't recognize, tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp features and piercing amber eyes. The man stood close to Zera, their postures easy, familiar. It was a tableau of connection, of unspoken intimacy that made Ethan's chest tighten with an ache he couldn't explain. Who are you? Ethan called out, his voice carrying over the field. The man turned, his amber eyes locking onto Ethan's. For a moment, the weight of that gaze stole Ethan's breath. Then, the man smiled, a small, knowing curve of his lips that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. You know me, the man said, his voice low and steady. Ethan shook his head, his pulse quickening. No, I don't. The man tilted his head, his expression almost amused. Don't you? Before Ethan could respond, the scene shifted. The golden light faded, replaced by the muted glow of a candlelit room. Ethan stood in the corner, unnoticed by the two figures seated at a wooden table. Zera was there again, dressed in clothing that looked centuries old, a simple gown that flowed around her like water. Across from her sat the man with amber eyes, now clad in the armor of a knight. Their conversation was soft, intimate, the words indistinct. But the emotions were palpable, radiating through the room like heat. Ethan felt like an intruder, a ghost haunting a memory that wasn't his. And then Zera reached across the table, her hand resting on the man's. The gesture was so familiar, so achingly tender, that Ethan felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He wanted to look away, to run from the truth pressing down on him, but he couldn't move. You've always been with me, Zera said, her voice suddenly clear, as though she were speaking directly to him. In every life. The knight nodded, his amber eyes softening. And I always will be. The words echoed in Ethan's mind as the scene dissolved, replaced by another and another. A futuristic cityscape, where Zera and the amber-eyed man stood side by side, their faces lit by the glow of neon lights. A windswept desert, where they knelt together beneath a star-filled sky. A roaring battlefield, where the man shielded Zera with his own body, his expression fierce with determination. Each vision struck Ethan like a hammer blow, the weight of their connection growing heavier with every passing moment. He saw lifetimes of love, loss, and reunion, all tied to the same two souls, Zera and the man with amber eyes. Or was it Rex? When Ethan finally woke, he was lying on the couch, a damp cloth pressed to his forehead. The storm had passed, leaving the house quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. He blinked groggily, his head pounding as he tried to piece together what had happened. "You're awake," Zera's voice said softly. He turned his head to see her sitting beside him, her eyes filled with worry. Rex sat at her feet, his gaze fixed on Ethan with an intensity that made Ethan's heart skip a beat. "What happened?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. "You slipped outside," Zera said. "Rex found you and barked until I came out. He stayed with you the whole time." Ethan glanced at Rex, who didn't look away. For a moment they stared at each other and something passed between them, an understanding, a truce. Ethan felt the hairs on his arms stand on end, the memory of the vision still fresh in his mind. "I saw something," he said quietly, turning back to Zera. "When I was out, I saw you, and Rex. But not like this. It was different." Zera's breath caught, her eyes widening. "You did?" He nodded, his throat tight. "It was like I was watching other lives. You were with him, but he wasn't always a dog. Sometimes he was a man, a knight, a scientist, someone who's always been with you." Zera reached for his hand, her grip trembling. "Ethan, I didn't think you'd ever." "I didn't believe you," he said, cutting her off. "I didn't want to believe you. But now, I don't know what to believe." She held his gaze, her expression a mix of relief and sorrow. "You don't have to understand it all right now," she said softly. "Just, don't shut me out again." Ethan looked at her, then at Rex, who sat silently, his amber eyes filled with that same quiet patience Ethan had seen in his visions. The truth was overwhelming, incomprehensible, but it was also undeniable. "I'll try," Ethan said finally, his voice breaking. "I don't know if I can ever fully understand this, but I'll try." Zera smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. "That's all I ask." As she leaned forward to press a kiss to his forehead, Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of the vision still heavy in his chest. He didn't have all the answers, didn't know if he ever would, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. Whatever this bond was, it was bigger than him, bigger than any one lifetime. And maybe, just maybe, that was okay. The first rays of dawn filtered through the windows, casting soft golden light across the living room. Ethan sat at the edge of the couch, his elbows on his knees, staring down at his hands. They trembled faintly, not from fear, but from the lingering weight of the revelations that had cracked his world wide open. Across from him, Zera sat cross-legged on the floor, her dark eyes filled with quiet hope. Beside her, Rex lay stretched out, his amber gaze locked onto Ethan with an intensity that felt almost human. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, an invisible thread pulling taut as they waited for Ethan to speak. He opened his mouth, but the words felt too heavy, too fragile to voice. Finally, he broke the silence. "I've spent my whole life trying to make sense of things," he said quietly. "I like knowing how things work, what makes them tick. But this," he looked up, meeting Zera's gaze. "This doesn't fit into any of that." Zera reached for him, her hand resting lightly on his. "Some things aren't meant to be understood," she said softly. "They're just meant to be felt." Ethan nodded slowly, his chest tightening as he turned his gaze to Rex. The dog had been a silent observer through all of this, his presence steady and unwavering. For so long, Ethan had seen Rex as just that, a dog. A loyal companion, maybe even a protector. But now he saw something more in those amber eyes, something ancient, familiar, and unbreakable. "I saw him," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "In that vision or dream, whatever it was, I saw how much he means to you, how much he's always meant to you." Zera's breath hitched, and she squeezed his hand. "And now you know why I couldn't tell you right away, why it was so hard to explain. It's not just him," though Ethan continued, his voice growing steadier. "It's you. It's the way you love him. It's timeless. Bigger than anything I've ever known." Zera blinked back tears, her expression equal parts relief and heartbreak. "I didn't want it to take anything away from us, Ethan. I didn't want you to feel like you didn't matter." "I did," he admitted, the words cutting through the room like a blade. "I felt like I could never compare to that kind of bond. Like I'd always be second place." She flinched, her shoulders sagging. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "That was never my intention." Ethan reached for her now, his fingers brushing against hers. I know, he said. And maybe I can't fully understand what you two have. But I can see it, I can feel it, and I can accept it. The days that followed were a quiet reckoning. Ethan and Zera rebuilt the bridge between them, one conversation, one shared moment at a time. They didn't rush the process, instead allowing the wounds to heal at their own pace. And through it all, Rex remained at their side, his presence a silent reassurance that they weren't alone in this. One evening, as the three of them sat on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Zera leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder. "Do you remember the first time you met Rex?" she asked, her voice tinged with nostalgia. Ethan smiled faintly. "Yeah, you brought him home from the shelter, and he wouldn't stop staring at me. It freaked me out a little." Zera chuckled, her breath warm against his neck. "He was sizing you up." "Did I pass?" Ethan teased, though his voice held genuine curiosity. Zera lifted her head, her eyes sparkling in the fading light. "Eventually." He laughed, the sound rich and full, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt the weight of his doubts begin to lift. "Well, I guess I owe him a thank you," he said, "for not scaring me off." Zera reached down to scratch behind Rex's ears, her touch gentle and affectionate. "He wouldn't have let you go, even if you'd tried." It was during one quiet night, weeks later, that Ethan truly understood the depth of the love he shared with Zera and the role Rex played in it. They had settled into a new rhythm, one built on trust and a deeper understanding of each other. But even in this newfound peace, there were moments when Ethan still felt the old doubts creeping in, whispers of inadequacy that he hadn't yet silenced. That night, as they lay in bed, Zera fast asleep beside him, Ethan found himself staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the restlessness that had settled over him. He slipped out of bed and padded quietly into the living room, where Rex lay curled up on the rug. The dog lifted his head as Ethan approached, his ears pricking up in curiosity. "Can't sleep either, huh?" Ethan muttered, lowering himself to sit beside Rex. Rex didn't respond, of course, but his eyes softened, and he shifted closer, resting his head on Ethan's knee. The simple gesture sent a rush of emotion through Ethan's chest, and before he could stop himself, he began to speak. "I don't know how you do it," he said quietly. "How you've been there for her through all of this. All these lifetimes. It's overwhelming." Rex's tail thumped lightly against the floor and Ethan smiled faintly. "I guess I get it now," he continued. "Why she loves you so much. Why she needs you. But I hope you know she needs me too. Even if I'm just here for this life." For a moment, Rex simply looked at him, his amber eyes filled with something Ethan could only describe as understanding. And then, in a move so deliberate it left Ethan breathless, Rex leaned forward, pressing his head against Ethan's chest. Ethan froze, his breath catching. The gesture wasn't just affectionate, it was reassuring, an acknowledgement of something deeper. It felt like a truce, a silent promise that they could coexist, that their shared love for Zera didn't have to divide them. "Thanks," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything." The months that followed brought a sense of harmony Ethan hadn't thought possible. He and Zera grew closer, their love deepened by the trials they had faced together. And Rex remained a constant presence, not just as Zera's protector but as a part of their family, a bridge between the past and the present, binding them together in a way that felt unshakable. One night, as the three of them sat beneath a sky full of stars, Ethan reached for Zera's hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "You know," he said softly, "I think I finally get it." "Get what?" she asked, her gaze warm and curious. "The way love works," he said, glancing down at Rex, who lay beside them, his head resting on Zera's lap. "It's not about who's been there the longest or who's loved you the most. It's about being here now, in this moment. Together." Zera smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "That's all I've ever wanted." As they sat there, the stars above them a glittering tapestry of endless possibilities, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever questions remained unanswered, he knew they would face them as a team, a man, a woman, and a dog bound by a love that had endured across lifetimes.